In the winter of 1942, German soldiers stationed along the Eastern Front began reporting something that defied all tactical logic. Night after night, entire battalions would be obliterated, not by artillery, not by tanks, but by explosions that came from nowhere. The strange part? There was no warning, no engine roar, no searchlight could catch them. Just silence, followed by fire. One German officer wrote in his journal, "We do not fear the bombs. We fear the silence before them. When the engine stops, we know she is above us. And we know we are already dead." By 1943, over 23,000 tons of bombs had been dropped by a single Soviet regiment flying planes made of plywood and canvas. Their aircraft were so primitive they were invisible to radar. So slow, German fighters couldn't shoot them down without stalling. And so quiet, they earned a name that would haunt the Wehrmacht until the fall of Berlin: Nachthexen, the Night Witches. But here's what most people don't know. Every single pilot in that regiment was a woman. Most were teenagers, and not one of them was supposed to survive. This is their story. It begins on a night in October 1941, somewhere near the Dnieper River. The temperature has dropped below freezing. Snow falls in sheets across abandoned Soviet positions. German forces are less than 50 kilometers from Moscow. Stalin's armies are collapsing. Morale is shattered. The Red Air Force has lost thousands of planes in the first months of Operation Barbarossa. And in a makeshift airfield south of the front, a young navigator named Nadezhda Popova stands beside a biplane that looks like it belongs in a museum. It's a Polikarpov P-2, designed in 1928 as a crop duster. 2 open cockpits, wooden frame, fabric wings, maximum speed, 94 miles per hour. No guns, no armor, no radio, no parachute that works below 300 feet. Nadezhda is 20 years old. She's never flown at night. She's never dropped a bomb. And in less than an hour, she'll be ordered to fly directly over German encampments and destroy their supply depot. Her hands are shaking, not from cold, but from the knowledge that if a single tracer round punctures her fuel tank, the entire plane will ignite like a matchstick. She turns to her pilot, Yevdokia Nozel, and whispers, "Do you think we'll make it back?" Yevdokia doesn't answer. She just climbs into the cockpit, straps in, and signals the ground crew. The propeller sputters. The engine coughs to life. And as the little biplane rolls toward the frozen darkness, Nadezhda realizes something that no amount of training could have prepared her for. She is terrified. But she is also ready. Because 3 months earlier she had nothing. No uniform, no rank, no right to fly. She was just another woman told that war was not her place. Until one woman changed everything. Her name was Marina Raskova, already a legend before the war even started. In 1938, she became one of the first women to be named a hero of the Soviet Union after piloting a record-breaking flight across Siberia. When the Nazis invaded, she used her fame to do something unprecedented. She went directly to Stalin and demanded permission to form an all-female aviation unit. Stalin, desperate for any advantage, agreed. Within weeks, posters went up across the Soviet Union. Volunteer for the motherland. Women with education. Apply to the Air Force. The response was overwhelming. Factory workers, university students, school teachers, ballerinas. Over 2,000 women applied. Only a few hundred were accepted. They were sent to Engels, a remote airbase on the Volga River, where they were issued oversized men's uniforms, boots that didn't fit, and helmets that slipped over their eyes. Male officers laughed. Mechanics refused to work with them. Even some of their own countrymen whispered that this was a propaganda stunt, a desperate move by a dying regime. But Raskova didn't care. She trained them like soldiers. Navigation, bombing patterns, engine repair, formation flying, survival in sub-zero temperatures. And perhaps most importantly, she taught them how to cut their engines mid-flight and glide. Because the P-2 wasn't just old. It was nearly silent when the engine was off. And that silence, Raskova realized, could become their greatest weapon. By the spring of 1942, 3 regiments had been formed. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment, later designated the 46th Guards, was made up entirely of women. Pilots, navigators, mechanics, armorers, commanders, every role filled by women. No men allowed. Most were between 17 and 26 years old. None had seen combat, and in less than 6 months, they would become the most feared night raiders on the Eastern Front. But first, they had to learn what it meant to die. The P-2 was never designed for war. It was a training plane, a crop duster. Its top speed was slower than most German fighters' stalling speed. It had no defensive armament. The bomb load was laughable, just 2 50-kilogram bombs strapped under the wings. To carry more, navigators would hold bombs in their laps and drop them by hand. The cockpit was open to the elements. At 10,000 feet, temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Pilots flew without heated suits. Frostbite was common. Some lost fingers. Others went deaf from the wind. And yet, the P-2 had one advantage no one anticipated. It was invisible. German radar systems were designed to detect fast-moving metal aircraft. The P-2 was wood and fabric, flying at treetop level, slower than a car on a highway. Luftwaffe night fighters, with their minimum speed of 150 miles per hour, couldn't engage without stalling and crashing. Anti-aircraft guns, calibrated for high-altitude bombers, couldn't track something moving that low and that slow. But the real terror came from the tactic the women developed, the engine-cut glide. Here's how it worked. A P-2 would approach the target at altitude, engine running. Then, about 1 kilometer out, the pilot would cut the engine completely. The plane would go silent, just the whisper of wind over fabric wings. In that eerie quiet, the navigator would line up the target using nothing but moonlight and intuition. At the last possible moment, they'd release the bombs, restart the engine, and pull up, often so low that German soldiers could see their faces in the firelight. The psychological impact was devastating. German troops called it the sound of death, because once the engine stopped, there was no way to know where the bomb would fall. Searchlights were useless. Gunners fired blindly into the dark. And more often than not, the night witches were already gone before the explosion even registered. One German commander wrote, "We would rather face a dozen Sturmovix than a single P-2 in the night. At least with the Sturmovix, we can hear them coming." But the plane's fragility was constant. A single bullet could bring it down. Engine failures were common. Navigation was done by hand, using maps, compasses, and landmarks that were often invisible in the dark. Pilots flew without radios, relying on hand signals and flares to communicate. If you got lost, you died. If your engine failed over enemy territory, you died. If a searchlight caught you, you died. And yet, night after night, they flew. The first mission was chaos. October 1941. The target, a German munitions depot near the front line. 6 P-2s took off in loose formation, engines sputtering in the frozen air. Nadezhda Popova, flying as navigator, gripped the edge of her cockpit as her pilot, Yevdokia, guided them toward enemy lines. They had no escort, no covering fire, just the darkness and their orders. As they crossed into German-held territory, the sky erupted. Searchlights stabbed upward, crisscrossing like prison bars. Flak shells burst in orange clouds. Tracers screamed past, so close Nadezhda could feel the heat. One P-2 to their left took a direct hit. It disintegrated midair, no parachute, no survivors. Yevdokia didn't flinch. She cut the engine. Suddenly, the world went silent. Just wind. Just the creaking of wooden struts. The plane glided forward, a ghost slipping through the searchlight beams. Below, Nadezhda could see German soldiers running, shouting, pointing guns at shadows. She reached for the bomb release. Her hands were so cold she could barely feel the lever. She pulled. 2 bombs dropped. For seconds later, the munitions depot exploded in a fireball, so bright it lit up the entire valley. Yevdokia restarted the engine and pulled hard on the stick. The Po-2 screamed upward, wings shuddering, fabric tearing in the wind. They cleared the ridge by meters. Behind them, secondary explosions rippled across the German camp. Fuel trucks, ammunition, chaos. They made it back. Barely. Of the 6 planes that took off that night, only 4 returned. But the night witches had proven something. They could strike. They could survive. And they could make the Germans afraid. Life between missions was brutal. The regiment moved constantly, following the front line. Airfields were little more than mud clearings hacked out of forests. There were no hangars, no barracks. The women slept in dugouts or under their planes, wrapped in parachute silk and wool blankets that never kept them warm. Food was scarce, often just black bread, thin soup, and tea made from melted snow. Some went days without a hot meal. Others scavenged from abandoned villages. Weight loss was universal. Many developed chronic illnesses, pneumonia, dysentery, trench foot. And yet, there was laughter, singing, friendships forged in fire. Between sorties, they played cards, wrote letters home that might never arrive, shared stories of life before the war, dances, university, first loves. Some fell in love with each other, others with male pilots from neighboring regiments. But every morning brought the same ritual, checking the duty roster to see who had been killed the night before. Mechanics worked around the clock, patching bullet holes with fabric and glue, replacing shattered propellers, draining frozen fuel lines. Planes were shared. If your aircraft was too damaged to fly, you took someone else's, often still stained with their blood. The ground crews were women too. Teenage girls hauling bombs in the snow. Armorers loading ordnance by hand in sub-zero darkness. One mechanic, Inna Pasportnikova, once repaired an engine using a hairpin and a piece of wire. The plane flew 16 sorties before it finally fell apart. There were no days off, no rotations, no relief, just mission after mission, night after night until the war ended or you did. By the summer of 1942, the night witches were no longer an experiment. They were a weapon. German intelligence reports began referring to them by name. Propaganda posters appeared in occupied territories warning of Bolshevik witches who strike from the sky. The Luftwaffe issued orders that any pilot who shot down a night witch would receive an automatic Iron Cross. But shooting them down was nearly impossible. The regiment adapted. They flew in waves. One plane would draw searchlights and flak fire while 2 others glided in silently from different angles. By the time the Germans realized they'd been flanked, the bombs were already falling. Targets expanded. Ammunition depots, rail lines, command posts, troop concentrations, bridges, even tanks if they were stationary. One raid, led by Yevdokia Bershanskaya, the regiment's commander, destroyed an entire German motorized column in a single night. 18 Po-2s, flying back-to-back sorties, dropped over 200 bombs in under 3 hours. By dawn, the road was a graveyard of burning vehicles. At Stalingrad, the night witches flew support missions for Soviet infantry, harassing German positions every night for 5 months straight. Some crews flew up to 18 sorties in a single night, landing, rearming, and taking off again within minutes. Nadezhda Popova alone flew 852 combat missions during the war. Her plane was shot down multiple times. She survived crashes, engine fires, and forced landings in enemy territory. She was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union twice. But not everyone was so lucky. The names are too many to list. But some must be remembered. Yevgenia Rudneva, an astronomer before the war. Navigator. Brilliant tactician. Killed in April 1944 when her plane was hit by flak over Kerch. She was 23. Katia Ryabova and Nadia Yulianova, best friends since childhood. Flew together for 2 years. Shot down over Belarus in August 1943. They were found in the wreckage, holding hands. Paulina Makagon, 17 years old when she joined. completed over 300 missions, survived the war only to die in a training accident 3 months after victory. She was 20. The regiment held funerals without lights, without ceremony. There was no time. Bodies were buried in shallow graves near the airfield, marked with wooden crosses and helmet liners. Sometimes they flew the next mission only hours after laying a friend in the ground. Grief became routine. Loss became expected. And yet they kept flying. Because the alternative, giving up, surrendering, letting the Germans win, was unthinkable. By 1944, the Soviet Union was pushing west. The Night Witches moved with them through Ukraine, Poland, into Germany itself. Their missions grew more dangerous. German defenses stiffened. Night fighters hunted them relentlessly. New flak systems, faster and more accurate, filled the skies. The Luftwaffe deployed elite units specifically tasked with destroying the 588th. And yet the Night Witches pressed on. They flew over the Vistula, over the Oder, over the ruins of Königsberg. And on the night of May 2, 1945, they flew their final mission, over Berlin. The city was already falling. Soviet tanks rolled through the streets. Hitler was dead. But the Night Witches were still in the air, still dropping bombs, still refusing to stop until the war was truly over. When the ceasefire was announced, many of them were mid-flight. They landed in silence, taxied to a stop, and climbed out of their cockpits for the last time. The war was over. They had survived. But the cost had been unimaginable. Of the original volunteers, more than 30 had been killed in combat. Dozens more were wounded, disabled, or scarred beyond recognition. The regiment had flown over 23,000 sorties, more than any other Soviet aviation unit. They had dropped 3,000 tons of bombs and caused incalculable damage to German forces. And yet, when victory parades were held, they were often excluded. Male regiments received medals, promotions, honors. The Night Witches were quietly sent home. For decades, their story was forgotten. But legends do not die. In the years after the war, survivors began to speak. Memoirs were published. Documentaries filmed. Historians pieced together fragments of reports, letters, and eyewitness accounts. And slowly, the world began to understand what had happened in the skies over the Eastern Front. Today, the Night Witches are honored across Russia and beyond. Streets are named after them. Statues erected. Their faces appear on postage stamps and in museums. But perhaps the greatest tribute comes not from governments or historians, but from the soldiers who faced them. Even now, veterans of the Wehrmacht, old men in their 90s, speak of the Night Witches with a mixture of respect and fear. They remember the silence, the helplessness, the terror of knowing death was coming and being unable to stop it. One former German officer, interviewed in the 1990s, was asked what he remembered most about the Eastern Front. He paused. Then he said, "The sound of her engine stopping. Because when it went silent, we knew. We knew she was above us. And there was nothing we could do but wait. In the winter, when the wind is right, people say you can still hear it. A faint whisper, like fabric wings gliding through the dark. The old airfields are gone now, reclaimed by forests and fields. The women who flew are mostly gone too, their names carved into stone. But the story remains. A story of courage in the face of annihilation. Of women who refused to be told they couldn't fight. Of pilots who turned fragile biplanes into instruments of terror. Of crews who flew through fire, ice, and darkness. Not for glory, but for survival. They were students, daughters, friends, teenagers who had never held a bomb before the war. And by the time it ended, they were legends. The Night Witches, the silent hunters, the women who made the sky itself a weapon. And when her engine went silent, the Germans knew death was coming.